I'll restart the meeting. I wish to welcome the following witnesses to the meeting. Minister, you're very welcome. Minister for Environment, Community, Local Government, Mr Ryan, Principal Officer, Mr MacDonald, Principal Officer, Ms Connolly, Principal Officer, Dominic O'Brien, Assistant Principal Officer, and Mr Alex Hurley, Administration Officer, on behalf of the Department of Environment and Local Government. Minister, you're well used to giving evidence, so you would know this Section 7(1) off by heart. But I will remind members, or remind of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on or criticise or make charges against a person outside of House or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I'll now call on the Minister Hogan to make his opening statement.
Chairman and members of the committee, first of all I want to thank you for inviting me to discuss the agenda for the next meeting of the EU Environment Council, which takes place next Thursday, the 12th of June in Luxembourg. This will be the final Environment Council of the Greek presidency, and it takes place amid major changes in the EU institutions over the coming months. These changes have commenced already with the recent elections to the European Parliament, the 8th Parliament to be directly elected, and over the coming weeks key positions within the Parliament will be filled so as to position MEPs to play a key role in the co-decision procedure which is underpinning the development of EU legislation and policies. There are two substantive legislative items for discussion on the agenda next week: an orientation debate on a proposal from the European Commission for directives on a clean air package for Europe, and secondly, a first reading of a regulation providing for the restriction or prohibition of the cultivation of GMOs in Member States' territories. Clean air is an issue that I feel very strongly about and to which I have devoted much time and effort in recent years. In Ireland, we have had some notable success in addressing the very severe air pollution problems, which resulted primarily from the widespread use of smoky coal in our cities during the 80s and 90s. And these emissions still occur, albeit at a lower level, and the science now indicates that air pollution, even at low levels, impacts on our health. The EPA reports higher levels of such air pollutants in some of our smaller towns than in our larger cities, where smoky coal and other solid fuels continue to be used for home heating. However, we cannot be complacent. Many EU member states are still falling short of agreed EU air quality standards. And here in Ireland, the air pollution guidelines of the UN World Health Organization are not fully being met. You only have to look at the threats to human health posed by elevated air pollution events earlier this year in the UK and France to understand the risks for our citizens. Air pollution does not recognise borders and can affect regional neighbours. The risks posed by transboundary air pollution can only be addressed through international cooperation. And in this context, under the auspices of the NSMC, I initiated a cross-border study to consider how best to address residential solid fuel emissions on an all-island basis. The EU Clean Air Package, which was unveiled in December 2013, is the culmination of a major review of air policy that began in early 2011. It comes after extensive consultations that found broad support for EU-wide action in this area. The content of the EU's proposal was considered by an Air Science Policy Forum that I hosted in Dublin during Ireland's EU presidency last year. The forum considered the most up-to-date scientific research in relation to air pollution and human health and the environment, and this informed subsequent discussion of EU environment ministers. The package includes a proposal for a revised National Emission Ceilings Directive, with stricter national emission ceilings for 5 main air pollutants, including fine particulate matter, a pollutant which strongly correlates with health impacts. The proposed emission ceilings for 2020 are broadly in line with Ireland's own national projections, but proposed ceilings for 2025 and 2030 would require further action. However, for ammonia from 2020, further abatement measures will be required, beyond those already agreed for 2020. This will present a challenge for the agricultural sector, which is responsible for the vast majority of these emissions, and which is projecting growth in line with ambitions under Food Harvest 2020. My officials are in ongoing discussion with the Department of Agriculture on this matter. The package also includes a proposal for a new directive to reduce pollution from medium-sized combustion plants between 1 and 50 megawatt output, such as energy plants for large buildings and small industrial installations. The proposal also aims to take account of compliance costs, impact on small and medium-sized enterprises, and keeping the administrative burden at the lowest possible level, while at the same time providing minimum levels of protection to safeguard human health and the environment. By 2030, the Clean Air Package aims to avoid 58,000 premature deaths. Health benefits alone from the package could save society €40 to €140 billion in external costs and provide billions in direct benefits due to higher productivity of our workforce, lower healthcare costs, higher crop yields and less damage to buildings. It is estimated to have a positive net impact on economic growth. So Ireland in many ways enjoys cleaner air than many of our European neighbours due to a variety of factors, including meteorological conditions, limited smokestack or heavy industry, and implementation of European as well as national clean air policy initiatives. However, challenges still remain to ensure that air quality is protected and enhanced into the future. And I think it is important that we look at clean air policy in the broader context, not just in isolation. We need to consider the wider benefits by taking account of impacts and synergies with other policy areas like health, climate, transport, economic productivity and so on, in framing any new policies and approaches. The Irish position will continue to support measures that have demonstrated to be cost-effective, achievable and that support related policy briefs. As regards GMOs, the Presidency is seeking political agreement on a proposed amendment to Directive 2001/18/EC on the deliberate release of GMOs. The amendment, if progressed, would allow Member States to restrict or prohibit the commercial cultivation of GMOs in their territory under defined criteria. Since the Commission originally proposed this amendment to the Deliberate Release Directive back in 2010, Ireland has been generally supportive of the concept of individual Member States possessing greater powers in this area. We previously expressed some reservations on the legal compatibility of the proposal with internal market rules and the rules of World Trade Agreements. However, Ireland has adopted a more positive view on the file as the text has developed. The draft submitted to the Council has significant support across Member States, and I propose to vote in favour. I would note that none of the GM crops currently authorised for commercial cultivation within the European Union are considered relevant to Irish agriculture. In that sense, Ireland would not have an immediate need to consider implementing the provisions of the proposal. Indeed, we can learn from the initial experiences of other Member States. Moving on to the non-legislative items on the agenda, the Council will discuss draft conclusions on the Convention on Biological Diversity and will hold a policy debate on the 2030 framework for energy and climate. While my colleague Minister Deenihan is the lead minister responsible for nature and biodiversity matters, I will represent Ireland at Council in discussions on this topic. The Council conclusions set out the EU position in preparation for a number of forthcoming meetings, namely the 12th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to CBD, the first meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing, and the 7th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. Ireland can strongly support the overall aims and themes of the conclusions around the importance of biodiversity and ecosystem services and the need to step up efforts to halt the loss of biodiversity. The Council conclusions reflect and highlight some of the achievements of the EU, particularly in relation to the progress on the strategic plan for biodiversity. Later this year, my colleague Minister Deenihan expects to publish a mid-term review of the implementation of Ireland's National Biodiversity Plan, which will highlight Ireland's contribution to both EU and international progress on the CBT objectives. The conclusions also aim to re-emphasise the commitments made to ratify the Nagoya Protocol with a view to having the first Conference of the Parties and meeting of the parties to the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. The Department of Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht is working with other government departments and agencies to determine the practical requirements to give effect to the Nagoya Protocol. In that regard, ratification is likely to occur in 2015. The Cartagena Protocol, the third element of the Council conclusions, seeks to protect biodiversity from potential risks arising from the transboundary movement of any living modified organisms resulting from modern biotechnology that may have an adverse effect on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. There are 167 parties to the protocol, and all EU member states, including Ireland and the EU itself, are parties. The protocol was adopted as a supplementary agreement to the Convention on Biological Diversity. A programme of work associated with the Cartagena Protocol is discussed and approved by meetings of the parties which take place every 2 years. Ireland supports the overall EU position outlined in the conclusions. In particular, Ireland welcomes the call for parties to agree on a realistic budget consistent with the agreed strategic priorities, functions and programme of work for the effective implementation of the Cartagena Protocol. Adopting this more pragmatic approach should reduce the need for ad hoc requests for additional voluntary funding for intersessional activities as has occurred previously. At its March meeting, the European Council agreed to have a stocktake of the proposed policy framework for climate and energy in the period to 2030 at its June meeting, with a view to the European Council taking a decision on the headline targets in October 2014. It is in that context that the Environment Council will consider elements of the framework at its meeting on the 12th of June. Responding to the recent communication from the Commission on a policy framework for climate and energy in the period from 2020 to 2030, the European Council has stated that a coherent European energy and climate policy must ensure affordable energy prices, industrial competitiveness, security of supply and achievement of our climate and environmental objectives. The emphasis on the need for coherence between greenhouse gas emission reductions, renewable energy and energy efficiency is central to a cost-effective policy framework and security and affordability of energy supply for households and businesses. This initial direction from the European Council puts the cross-sectoral nature, as well as the scale and importance of the 2030 challenge, in very clear perspective. Priority elements still to be agreed with a view to the EU decision in October 2014 include the question of EU headline targets, in particular the greenhouse gas emission reduction target, and the proposed EU-wide renewable energy target, as well as the general principles accompanying the framework, such as effort sharing and the proposed governance structure. Ireland has previously outlined its concerns in relation to some elements of the framework proposal, and we are continuing our engagement with the Commission at all levels to further understand the possible implications for Ireland and to ensure that a fair and cost-effective solution is reached. This work will continue and intensify in the coming weeks and months. While dealing with climate matters, let me also touch on an AOB item regarding the Kyoto Protocol. In December 2012, at the Doha Climate Change Conference, the parties to the Kyoto Protocol adopted the so-called Doha Amendment, which, inter alia, establishes a second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol from 2013 to 2020, with legally binding greenhouse gas emission reduction commitments for specified parties, including the EU and its member states. The formal entry into force of the Doha Amendment is an important objective for the EU. This requires 144 of the 192 parties to the Kyoto Protocol, including the EU and its member states, to deposit their instruments of ratification. The proposal for a Council decision aims to achieve ratification on behalf of the EU. The proposal remains under discussion within Council with a view to adoption this year. I should add that Ireland's emission reduction commitment in the second commitment period, like those of EU's other member states, is the same as that under existing EU legislation. So no additional commitment is being entered into as a result of ratification of the Doha Amendment. Ireland's ratification of the Doha Amendment involves a formal government decision and the passing of a resolution in Dáil Éireann, preparations for which have commenced. Turning briefly to national climate policy matters, I would like to mention that on the 23rd of last I released a national climate policy position and the general scheme of a climate action and low carbon development bill. The national position provides a coherent, high-level policy direction for the adoption and implementation by government of plans to enable the state to pursue and achieve transition to a competitive, low-carbon, climate-resilient and environmentally sustainable economy by 2050. Complementing the national policy position, the general scheme of the bill provides a statutory basis for this national transition objective via the preparation of successive five-yearly national low-carbon roadmaps and successive national climate change adaptation frameworks. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Committee for its report on the outline heads of the bill, and I look forward to further engagement with the Committee on the proposed provisions as the bill progresses through the Oireachtas. Coming back to next Thursday's Council agenda, over lunch we will have an informal discussion on the current state of play regarding the outcome of the Rio Plus 20 conference, and we are currently awaiting details from the Greek presidency on the nature of these discussions, so I suppose I am not in a position, therefore, to elaborate further at this stage. At the end of the day's business, the Council will consider a number of items under AOB, including the current state of play on a proposed regulation on emissions from maritime transport and a proposal for a directive on plastic carrier bags. Ministers will also receive information on a number of issues, including endocrine disruptors, highly fluorinated substances, and the work programme of the incoming Italian presidency. Detailed debate is not expected on any of these items. Chairman, this is a brief run through the main items for next Thursday's Council agenda, and I'm happy to deal with any questions, or indeed my officials, if there are any technical questions and any information regarding the working groups that are ongoing with my officials, will be glad to take questions and happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your opening statement and for your officials attending today. Can I just take the opportunity, Minister, maybe just to pick up on you there just at the end. You mentioned the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Bill, which you rightly said many members worked extremely hard over last summer in developing. That report was given to you. Will you be able to give us some confirmation whether that would be introduced to the Dáil before the summer recess?
Well, I expect to go back to government before the summer recess with the conclusions of our final piece of legislation and with a view to publication, and we'll be glad to facilitate members and take into account a lot of the good views that came from this committee. I'm not in a position to say when it will be going to government yet, but I hope to be in the next couple of weeks.
And just, Minister, you indicated at an earlier stage that you may set up the expert advisory group on an ad hoc basis. Is that still your intention?
Well, as It's my intention all along anyway, in order to do that, but there's been a slowdown in actually finalising some of the people that were actually being proposed for that expert group, but I hope that maybe with your assistance from yourself, Chairman, that we might be able to resolve that shortly.
Indeed. Thank you, Minister. Members, Senator.
Thank you. And thank you, Minister, for coming in here this morning. I just have two questions. The first is as regards the policy framework for climate and energy in the period 2020 to 2030. Do you consider feasible Oxfam's call for binding national targets of energy savings of 40%, boosting sustainable renewable energy by 45% and reducing emissions by at least 55% by 2030? And will Ireland be supporting the present proposals of this framework, or will we be looking for more ambitious targets? And also just what exactly is proposed in relation to the proposal for a directive of the European Parliament and the Council for the monitoring, reporting and verification of carbon dioxide emissions from maritime transport? Are we talking about CO2 detectors or on board commercial ships, or just what enforcement mechanisms are envisaged there on that? Thank you.
Well, as Senator Norton knows, that we will not have defined national targets in our legislation, but we were complying, as we're obliged to do under EU law, EU binding targets, and that is actually the role that we are playing here in this country in line with our other EU member states. The binding targets in relation to renewable energy are matters for Minister Rabbitte, and this will form part of the sectoral plans, of course, that will come from each of the departments arising from the enactment of our climate bill during the course of this year. And a lot of work is going on in each of the relevant departments in energy, agriculture, transport in particular, to ensure that we do meet our obligations. But there are a lot of challenges on the renewable energy side. And even though we have indicated our targets for 2020 as part of our objectives, we are aware that there are a lot of challenges in meeting those particular targets, not least 2020, but also then going forward, what our level of ambition should be for 2030. And there are certainly, I suppose, indications from the modelling that we're doing that renewable energy targets, because of some of the controversies that have gone on, are going to be more difficult to meet those particular targets. So I'm sure that the Minister for Energy will be glad to outline to you in more detail. I don't want to preempt what will come forward in any sectoral plan or in his policy papers in relation to his role in his department in meeting our national climate change objectives. In relation to maritime transport, I'd ask one of my officials who was dealing with that area maybe to maritime transport.
I'm not sure if I understood the question.
Could you ask the question again?
It is in relation to what exactly is envisaged with regard to monitoring, verification on board commercial ships with regard to CO2 emissions. Are we looking at CO2 detectors, or what exactly is envisaged with regard to the enforcement mechanisms on board these commercial vessels?
That's too.
We'll come back to you on that.
Okay.
We'll come back to Senator. Yeah, we don't have the relevant official here today, but we'll come back to you on that.
Okay, thank you.
We'll take a note of it.
Sorry, Deputy Michelle Mahern.
Chairman. Minister, in relation to our transport emission targets, I just wonder, could you maybe update us on the road plan for that? And in that context, would it or could it be considered that we make a move towards the utilisation of liquid gas so as to displace dependency on petrol and diesel, which I understand would just require a simple modification to a vehicle, but I believe it would have to be policy driven. I say this also with I suppose, commercial benefits in mind as well. We're hopefully going to see gas coming from the Carb gas field, and I know that there is a plant, I believe in the south of the country, that's at least looking for permission to produce liquid gas. But I think that as a more immediate step towards reducing our transport emissions, we need to be looking at something like this. And also, we're never really going to displace petrol, diesel, oil, unless We have viable alternatives when people go to the pumps, go to their filling stations, and I'm talking about as an alternative even to the electricity chargers that are there now. We know that really they're only going to take off as things stand from a cost point of view and from an effectiveness point of view in cities and on small journeys, and really in the rural areas where I serve, I cannot see them unless there's advances in technology and to the output from the batteries there. That's one question. I have more, shall I? Okay. The next thing is, in the context of the framework for energy and climate, which is under discussion at the moment, I note that the Commission's proposals will set out a new set of indicators to ensure a competitive and secure energy system, affordable, I think you also mentioned in your speech. And I think that really is going to be the clinch point for the ordinary person who, we know there's a problem with energy poverty, and there are a lot of people who can't afford to fill the oil tank in their house when it comes to winter time. And ultimately, though, that as we develop renewables, we know that at least to begin with, they're more expensive. So what's the plan to make fuel more affordable in the long term because we invest in renewables? I understand, as I say, the initial startup requires more investment, it's more costly, but at what point and how do we achieve this? What's the plan to make fuel costs more affordable for the ordinary domestic consumer? And I say this also in the context of the practice that's happening in, say, local authorities with local authority housing, where they're maintaining and renewing housing stock, which additional funding has been put forward by government recently. We know that they do the windows, the doors, insulation, but of concern to me is that the heating systems that they're upgrading and putting into houses are oil-fired central heating, traditional heating systems, which either means people are dependent on oil, and in many cases if they can't put oil in the tank, they're having to buy coal to buy their fuel by the week. They're buying a bag of coal. So how is this person going to avoid carbon tax? Like, what choices has somebody in that situation going forward? Because I think these are real relevant questions, and unless people can see the benefits of renewables in the short to medium term, and that they're not going to be laden with more and more cost, which frankly they can't afford, then we're not going to be winning the debate. So the idea in some vague way that there's going to be reduction in costs to the consumer, I think it has to be planned or plotted out more clearly for general public discourse, so that people can say, yes, this is the right way forward. We want to be environmentally responsible, but you know, we've become so dependent on fossil fuels for all our technology, all our lifestyles, that transition cannot be unduly burdensome. And I know that in general you recognise this when you talk about business and hitting targets, that we have to be realistic. And then just on the final point of biodiversity, it's just a comment. I feel that there really, if you look across the board as we try and introduce measures to ensure biodiversity, which is very important, we really have an awful lot of gap in knowledge among the general public, and I'll include myself in that, and maybe haven't had the opportunity for more exposure to the importance of biodiversity and our environment. There is no educational policy, as I see, around biodiversity, bar the Green Flag initiative, which is more prevalent in primary schools and not in secondary schools. You see young people there who get an appreciation, because you're talking about looking at ecosystems on a very minute basis. Mostly we pass these things by and don't appreciate the value of taking measures and steps to preserve it. So I feel that there needs to be, whether it's to do with renewables, the need for whether it's wind energy, renewable energy policies and biodiversity, it has to feature more in our educational system, both at primary and secondary level, and not be just something left to the individual as to whether they want to embrace that sustainable environmental response to the way we live and the way we engage with our environment. I think we need to be more proactive.
Deputy Minister.
Well, Deputy Mulhern has asked a lot of questions there. Some of them, what I will say overall is that the reason why we have the approach we're taking in terms of our climate and energy agenda is because it was always left to the Department of the Environment to be concerned about these matters in the past. Now we have every government department having to come forward with sectoral roadmaps in terms of how they're going to comply with all of the objectives that they've set and which they've contributed to at government level. So it's not just an Department of Environment matter per se to be worried about these issues and to take the lead action. We do the coordination. So there is a good reason why we've done that, precisely along the lines that you've mentioned, where we have enormous challenges in transport and in energy in particular, and agriculture, in order to reduce our emissions and to accelerate, I suppose, the type of initiatives that we need to have in order to meet our targets in 2020. And we have no chance of meeting our targets on transport in the renewable side by 2020 at the pace we're going at the moment. And this will be, I suppose, an opportunity, I suppose, Mr. Chairman, to say to the committee that it would be very worthwhile for maybe a discussion with those departments to see what progress they're making in agriculture, transport and energy, where we'll be able to elucidate a lot of the issues that are relevant to them rather than our department in terms of where we're going to meet our objectives and what policy changes are needed in order to deal with many of the issues that you've mentioned. So, you know, and you're right about the rollout of electric vehicles. It's very patchy, it's very small in relative terms at the moment. And that goes for all of the renewable transport initiatives, which are, you know, rather difficult to attain at the moment. So I would welcome a debate on the sectoral roadmap preparations, and some of the issues that you mentioned could be included as part of the objectives and the programs that are necessary then to roll out that. And that comes to the energy retrofit scheme that you mentioned as well. And I think an excellent model has been developed by the Department of Energy and Sustainable Energy Ireland and the local government system with individuals, households where the local authority stock. A model has been developed where they can help each other in order to meet some of the energy retrofit schemes that will help to meet some of the objectives there in that respect. But we saw where Minister Abbott obviously has very difficult challenges arising from the collapse of the Green Deal in the UK as an example, where we were looking at how we could replicate that initially in government, and then discovered that there was difficulties with that scheme, and therefore you can't actually replicate something that has gone wrong in another jurisdiction. So we were fortunate to learn from that. But equally, he is trying to progress with the energy companies, particularly ESB, an opportunity where we can make it easier for people to pay for initiatives that they can take themselves in terms of reducing or in retrofitting their own particular homes. Like, if you want to change behaviour, financial instruments are the way to do it. So, on the one hand, if we want to achieve our objectives on energy and climate change, well, you know, if the fiscal instrument is through carbon tax, we can't have it everywhere. But we have to have compensatory mechanisms for people in fuel poverty arising from that. I agree with you on that. But carbon, there's no avoidance of carbon tax. You know, these are issues that we're going to have to deal with in terms of, but we want to make sure that the tax is targeted at the areas that are environmentally bad and try and accentuate the good practice and exemptions in relation to the products that we're trying to promote. And an example of that is smoky fuels, where I have this all-island study going on at the moment, because you can't deal with smoky fuels if you have a smuggling regime that's going to contradict or is going to circumvent a lot of the policy instruments that we're implementing for to change behaviour. I think that will demonstrate that there is alternative products on the market that are, you know, as competitively priced, that can actually meet higher efficiency in relation to fuel output and heating, and at the same time be able to deal with some of the issues that you mentioned in relation to you know, clean air policy, and you know, maybe some of those particular products could be looked at in the context of whether they're going to be exempt or there's going to be a sliding scale of treatment in relation to the implementation of carbon tax for those particular alternative products. So fiscal measures always actually change behaviour, and I don't think it'll be any different in the future if we're serious about meeting our objectives in this agenda. The lack of education on biodiversity, I agree with you. We have a national plan. There is a review going on of that national plan, and maybe part of that review, I would say, should include of how we're going to actually you know, have a more education around the issues that you mentioned. The Green School scheme is a great scheme, but again, it's going to take an awful long time for that particular good practice to percolate through all of the generations. But I have extended the Green School opportunity to secondary schools and to third level. And so hopefully those programmes will help people as they come through the primary sector, that they don't forget about the good practices that they have already been engaged with in primary school when they go to further education in the years beyond that. So I do agree that there's a lack of education on the value of biodiversity, and I know in your particular part of the world there is huge opportunity from a study, from students, from tourism point of view in the raised bogs that you have in the cagey fields and all of that particular area, which is one of the finest areas of biodiversity and protection of those particular very valuable lands of biodiversity that you have in North Mayo. So I am accepting what you're saying, and perhaps we could review how we can actually promote the protection of our biodiversity in the context of the review of our national plan during the course of this year.
Just a small supplementary, just on the, it's
Small, because I'll let you
it's
come back
just
in later.
in response. Just simply, Minister, how can someone in a council tenant in a council house who's been told they've had a recent upgrade of a heating system, I understand boilers can be more efficient, I understand that, they're forced into oil, buying oil or coal. How can they either contribute to reducing carbon emissions? Why are we driving them that direction? If I just give you a contrast, I know a voluntary housing association that's in my area, and they upgraded houses and put solar panels on the roof, which obviously is a carbon-friendly measure or carbon-reducing measure. And there doesn't seem to be any initiative on that side in housing with the local authorities that they're pursuing, that I'm aware of. So what's the option? How will taxing those people drive them away from, other than they're going to be cold in their houses?
We'll have a look at that with the Sustainable Energy Ireland are driving this particular scheme for us, or for the Department of Energy, but we will have a conversation with them to represent the views that you've just expressed and get clarification on.
Thank you, Chairman. Much of what I wanted to raise has already been raised by Deputy Mulcairn, but I would concur with some of the points, and I'll elaborate on them slightly. Minister, I'm in no doubt, and I'm sure you're in no doubt, and anybody's in no doubt, that the challenges that face us with regard to reducing our carbon emissions in general in this country across the various sectors, and to achieve those reductions will require cooperation across many levels, from the EU to government to opposition, to the sectoral interests, to NGOs and to the public. And I think we all have a responsibility to engage in an open and robust debate on this, and to be honest about it, because there is, I have concerns that there is a lot of, political point scoring. You have NGOs on the one hand, calling for climate change bills, which is a justified call, and, looking for targets to be set. But on the other hand then, when progress is being made, and I use, for example, renewable energy and proposals for wind farms, we can't have it everywhere. And, I think someday, sometime soon, we're going to have to own up to our responsibilities. If we want to reduce our dependence on oil and coal, we're going to have to support either wind farms, biomass, hydro, and what other renewable sources that are out there. But the conflict here is, and I see it in my own constituency, when a proposal is made for a wind farm or for a hydro scheme, you have the conflict then with protecting the biodiversity and the ecosystems, and people use that against such proposals. So there's a lot of conflicting elements out there that is stalling the progress with regard to reducing our emissions, and I think we need to be open and frank about that, and I'd like to hear your views on that. Also, I think the EU have a major role in helping to coordinate and to incentivise alternatives in the renewable energy sector. You mentioned it, Minister, we need to change our behaviour, we need to change work practices, we need to change old dependencies. We see it across the agri-sector, we see it across industry, and we see it across transport. The three areas that have been identified are the major challenges. So a lot of work needs to be done to bring the sectors with us and the people and the public with us as well. And, and I'm going to use some examples. The Clean Air Package is an example. Traditionally in this country, Minister, as you know, in rural Ireland and small towns and villages, people have had a high dependency on coal. Especially in our own region. We don't have access to turf, and we don't have access to other burning facilities. So you mentioned that the small towns are contributing now quite a bit to the emissions, and that's why the Clean Air Package needs to be addressed. I mentioned, we had SEAI in here recently, Minister, and I mentioned an open fire is, I think it's only 20% efficient in what you burn within that fire. 80% of the heat goes up the chimney or out. And, you know, we have a lot of incentives for, you know, wood pellet boiler systems, geothermal systems, which are all, you know, justified, but they're expensive systems to install, and when they're installed, they're very hard to manage and to control. And I just mentioned, like, you know, with the population that's out there and the concerns around fuel poverty, why can we not incentivise the installation of a simple stove in somebody's house? A stove is the reverse efficiency of an open fire, where it's 80% efficient and 20% of the heat goes up the chimney. And they're quite cheap, and yes, there is still a dependence on solid fuel burning, but it will reduce the amount of burning, it will reduce the amount of emissions, and it's a lot cheaper to install in a lot of the houses that Deputy Mulhern has spoken about. So, you know, there's the 80% rule where we can actually have a big impact by introducing small interventions, rather than trying to intervene with high-cost renewables that have a low impact. And I would ask officials, the SAI and others, to consider that. The 80% impact rule is for low-level interventions that achieve a high level of return, and a simple stove can achieve that. And there should be incentives around that. And I'm only using that as an example to assist in reducing our carbon emissions, and also to assist in taking on board the concerns regarding fuel poverty. You mentioned that the targets for the 2030 across the EU target a 58,000 reduction in premature deaths. I presume that's in relation to asthma or cancer-related illnesses from the air that we breathe. And you might just clarify that. Is it from carcinogens from industry, or where is that target, or why is that target being set? Also, does the Clean Air Package, Minister, does it apply to waste management facilities? Because again, going back to renewable options and all the rest of it, we have to have waste management facilities, and when we install them or want to install them in particular areas, we have a lot of concerns from the public and objections regarding odours and you know, the air quality in those areas. So does this Clean Air Package that you'll be discussing at EU level relate to waste management facilities also? And can I just move slightly then to one side again with regard to biological diversity? And I think we all agree that we must play our part in the conservation and protection of our ecosystems. But again, I have a genuine concern here on the ground, Minister, and we have seen recently with the recent flooding, and I know this has been raised in the past at various levels, where a river bank busts its bank and extensive flooding happens in an area, and you know, it has a huge negative impact on agriculture, on agricultural output, and most importantly has a huge negative impact on dwellings that are flooded. There is a huge conflict here, again, where we're trying to protect our ecosystems, but when flooding occurs, that there is huge restrictions on people repairing their riverbank, returning their lands to normal agricultural practice, and in fact getting into their homes. And I've had direct experience of this in County Waterford, where the River Suir breached its banks recently, a couple of months ago in February, due to the heavy rainfall, and it's all related. But when the people that had to leave their homes because they were flooded went to repair their banks, the bureaucratic barriers that they faced were huge. They needed waste permits, they needed planning permission, they needed environmental impact assessments, and all of this is feeding into a negative reaction from residents in a huge hinterland to protecting diversity and biological habitats. These are the farmers that are living along the riverbanks for generations, that have protected these habitats, are now being forced into a negative reaction to SACs, special areas of conservation, and there is opposition in the public, and that needs to be addressed. And like, it's all very well to bring in policies and directives and all the rest of it, but unless our public and our citizens buy into it, we're going to face huge opposition. So what I'd be calling for, Minister, to address the likes of that, and I support protecting ecosystems and biological diversity, that we have tangible, practical systems or protocols where crisis situations arise due to flooding or whatever, that in collaboration with the local authority, in collaboration with the Habitats and Wildlife Service, that there is an easier system to return people's livelihoods and their agricultural lands and their residents back to normality, that we don't have this bureaucratic mess and tangle that we have at the moment. So these, as a public representative, are issues that I'm picking up on the ground, Minister. I know your officials and yourselves go to Europe with the best of intentions, but I think you need to go with practical examples of how these are impacting on Irish citizens. And I would ask that you and your officials would address those in the best interests of our citizens, but also keeping in line with, you know, the directives that we're meant to comply with. So there are just some issues that I'd like to raise with you, Minister, and I'd hope that you might raise them at an EU level as well. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Deputy Coffey. I completely comply with your assertion that there is huge contradictions in terms of policy by various groups. On the one hand, they want particular objectives at national level, and they regularly, talk to me about why I'm not doing more in terms of meeting sectoral challenges that are there in terms of our targets for climate change or renewable energy or reducing our emissions generally, and at the same time we're the first people out there in protests and objections to progress that we're trying to make. So I agree with you totally that we need to have a reflection on all sides of the debate to know how we're going to meet our objectives, because you can't have it every way. The reason why I did the clean air package, and which I have such an interest in it, is I see huge evidence in relation to health, public health, the enormous amount of contact that we have with the people in the health community about asthma and about unintended consequences of normal living is huge. And that's well documented at this stage, and in fact is documented to the extent that there's an unanswerable case to doing something about it. Why would you, as a government ministry, want to proceed with a policy that's actually going to contribute to more people dying? We want to do the reverse. We want to ensure that people have a good quality of life, and we want to save people's lives and keep them out of institutional and expensive care. So the target of 58,000 is a target that's set through the clean air in terms of all emissions and how we can contribute to reducing deaths, which includes waste management. Emissions are emissions no matter where they come from, Deputy Coffey. So waste management facilities is included in that. In Kilkenny is the only place I can give you a live example in terms of the coordination between SEAI, the local authority, and the housing organisations, where they come together with the money that the local authorities get from energy retrofit from my department, or monies that the SEI get from Minister Rabbitt's department, that they come together and they have adopted a model of where all of the stakeholders can actually achieve an objective in local authority houses or in community facilities by actually implementing, with a bit of help from each other, a very good package, which included the provision of stoves in local authority houses. So the 80% rule that you mentioned is actually already in existence, but unfortunately only in a small number of cases in the part of the country. So I would say, Chairman, that there is a model of best practice that could be developed that will give a big dividend for householders and a big dividend for the objectives that we're trying to achieve in terms of energy efficiency. And perhaps SEAI, who are very, very much involved in this, should be the coordinators, but equally the local authorities and the Department of Energy and the housing unit in particular in the department can actually coordinate it better to achieve in a more accelerated programme, where people will buy in big time in relation to having more heat in their homes, but also more efficiency in terms of the use of that energy. I also agree with you in relation to the need for common sense in relation to implementation of our statutory responsibilities at a time of crisis. And I have seen it firsthand with you, Deputy Coffey, the issues that you raised around the River Suir. We have, I think, a bureaucratic system built up that is not fit for purpose at the moment in dealing with the crisis of where humans, through no fault of their own, but through unexpected and unintended consequences from weather patterns, are actually having to deal themselves with this bureaucracy, and it is contributing to a negative view of European directives and a negative view of some of the organisations that we have under in the state that are dealing with these matters. And I would say that the National Parks and Wildlife Service needs to sit down and review the type of measures that are being implemented at the moment at a time of crisis, where I visited a home where it was flooded, where there was absolute mayhem in terms of what people were going to do next, and uncertainty in relation to where they were going to find the means of a livelihood, as well as find the means of where they were going to have a home for the following few months, or indeed up to 6 or 12 months in some cases before they were resolved. So protocols are required for crisis management. common sense is a little bit suspect in relation to matters that are come under the term crisis, particularly in relation to storm damage and flooding. So I will actually be in contact with Minister Deanhan to see how we can actually get the National Parks and Wildlife Service, the local authorities, the OPW and all of the various stakeholders around the table to work out that protocol that you've called for, which I fully support.
On that, Minister, I understand that there is some crisis management protocol for state agencies already in existence, but what I'm asking for is an extension of that to citizens where a crisis involves around a flooding event or an extreme weather event. And I do know, as far as I understand, that the IFA are also working on that, and I would ask that, you know, the departments, both your department and Minister Deanahan's department, would work with the like of sectoral interests like the IFA and others to come up with a protocol that works and that will get the support of the citizens that are affected. And in the business community, they have business continuity crisis management plans, and the definition in simple terms of it is it's common sense applied in a structured manner. Common sense applied in a structured manner. And that's what we need with regard to the application of EU directives. Because if directives are negatively impacting on people's livelihoods, their homes and their families, that goes out into a wider community and it turns people against them. So that's the message I'd like to go to Europe, that we need them practical, that in the event of a crisis that we can manage them, and otherwise we manage them to protect our ecosystems and our biodiversity in a way that's possible.
No, I support that fully, and I actually will ask as well Sean Hogan, who's the head of emergency delivery of the emergency response in my department, to have a look at this as part of the lessons of the storm of the winter of 2013-2014 as well, to see how we can get practical solutions at a time of crisis for many citizens and householders, and where livelihoods are actually at risk as well. But what we're supposed, just to conclude on the issues, Cathaoirleach, what we're trying to do here is to recognise that there's a need to get down to specifics, and your examples that you've given today is an example of where practical measures can be taken to meet our national sectoral objectives. So when we get the departments, you know, before us with their sectoral plans, let's see what are the practical programmes that they're going to have proposed that will meet our objectives, and that have a common sense view about it, and have something that will actually make our European objectives or climate change targets that we have to comply with practical and implementable, and that people will feel good about it rather than feel it's a challenge for them.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, could I just conclude by asking you a couple of questions, and maybe to give you an opportunity. There was a huge concentration earlier this week on the EU review of our budget, and I see today in the farming journals there's another a lot of media coverage in relation to fines in relation to the agricultural sector. And where I'm bringing this, Minister, is in that review, it states that Ireland is not on course to meet its greenhouse gas emission targets in its non-emission trading systems. And it states that although Ireland has adopted a number of specific action plans related to energy efficiency and climate action, little progress has been made on specific actions that lead it to meet the climate and environmental targets under the Euro 2020. I'm just wondering, have you had an opportunity to review the statements that were made earlier this week in Europe? I know, as I said, there was a huge concentration initially on about the 2 billion correction in our budget. There's a concentration today in relation to agriculture and possible fines in relation to the CAP scheme, but there's been little or no discussion in relation to the remarks that were made about hitting the targets for 2020. So I wonder, would you like to take an opportunity just to respond to that review document that was published by the EU on Monday?
Yeah, I didn't get an opportunity to look at that document yet. It's published by the EU, but we are obviously being alerted to these matters by the EPA in recent pronouncements that they've made, and we're subscribing to the view that you've expressed, that there is a challenge in meeting our 2020 targets. And it's not just in agriculture and transport we're under pressure on energy, renewable energy target as well. So it is quite a source of great concern to us in complying with our 2020 target, which, as you know, is we're obliged under EU law. It's national law, effectively, because of the compliance. So compliance is not an option. It is binding under EU law. And what we've been trying to do, I suppose, is get the message through to the various departments that they have a problem. Let's see their sectoral plans and the colour of their money in relation to what the policy position is going to be, and we will get that in the autumn. But we are concerned about the fact that the state will have to maybe face the prospect, hopefully not, in energy in particular, where we have a serious problem arising from some modelling we've done recently, of being subject to fines. But agriculture can come into balance. Transport is a pressure point, definitely because of the issues that we raised earlier, because of our I suppose, our inability up to now in getting through our renewable targets in transport. But the energy reduction target is understood by the government. The consequences is understood by the government, and I've conveyed that to them very openly and strongly during the course of the debate that we had in April at our cabinet meeting on our national climate policy.
And just a minute, just to clarify, I think, Minister, will your department be making a response to the EU review document, as we would see in the Department of Finance and other departments?
Yeah, we will be making a response, and we are in very detailed discussions with the Commission at the moment on the climate